Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar this morning, covering getting started with Windows workloads on Azure. As the UK's leading Microsoft Cloud partner, we strive to bring you the most pertinent information from the most trusted sources. We're joined today by Incentra, a global Microsoft Gold partner, with Aaron Parker, a principal consultant for Incentra, taking you through the webinar. Also, we have Mel Wilcock from Bytes to talk through the licensing requirements. A quick bit of housekeeping. During the webinar, you are muted, but you can submit questions at any time via the questions box on the right-hand side of the screen. There is a Q&A session at the end to answer those submitted questions. The webinar recording will be made available afterwards. And if you can please complete the critique form at the end where you can request a call back from one of our specialists at Bytes. I will now hand you over to Aaron.
I need to go off mute and talk at the same time. Would help. Can you see my screen there?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Okay, so I'm going to do a level 100 session on Windows workloads on Azure. And so I'm going to touch on a little bit what Azure is and some considerations around running Windows workloads, especially if this is something that you've not touched before. So my focus for the session, a bit of why, what, and how, and a little bit on, I'm just going to, as I say, I'm going to touch on just a couple of items on managing Windows workloads. So I think these are, being a technical person myself, I think the manage piece is I find quite interesting. So before I start diving into Windows workloads on Azure, I thought it might be interesting perhaps to just discuss a little bit about what Azure is. So what is Azure? Other than being a funny way to pronounce Azure, Azure is, of course, a couple of things. And in my mind, Microsoft Azure is probably two things. One, it's a journey. I think it's fair to say that Azure is not necessarily the destination, but it's a part of the journey that you are potentially embarking on to improve, make IT more responsive or achieve business goals, whatever it is. Azure is the platform, I guess, that you can leverage to achieve those goals. Two, Azure is a platform. So Azure is a lot of things. We're going to be talking about Windows running on virtual machines on Azure today. And typically for most customers, that's where they start. They start on looking at the workloads that they have on premises today and how do we get them to run in Azure for multiple reasons. A few of those which I'll talk about in a second. But Azure is it's a potentially a dizzying array of services that run on the platform, and it's sort of it's a platform that certainly doesn't stay still. So there are multiple ways that I can run Windows workloads on Azure. It might be infrastructure as a service where I'm just running Windows machines and picking up my existing workloads and my existing processes and applications, and I'm moving those to the Azure platform for several reasons. But there are quite a number of Azure native platforms that are available on Azure as well. So while I can do something like, for example, run SQL Server on a Windows virtual machine, I can even now run SQL Server on a Linux virtual machine on top of Azure. I can also look at Azure native services for SQL as well. So there is an Azure SQL where I can leverage just the SQL databases as a service instead of having to run Windows on a virtual machine and then SQL on top of it. But as I say, for most customers, typically what we see is that running Windows workloads on top of Azure is typically the first port of call. So if you're engaging with Bytes and Incentra, we'll certainly take you along on that journey, where to start, how to build a roadmap. And for most customers, that's potentially building some type of virtual data center inside Azure and running or migrating some existing workloads over to there. Certainly, I think it's interesting to understand where Azure is. So Azure, Microsoft, I should say, has quite a number of workloads in the UK as well as Ireland and Europe, as well as the rest of the world. So I could run workloads in UK South, for example, but I could also run workloads in Australia Southeast, and all managing that through the Azure platform. Microsoft is continually adding new regions as well. So if you're a business that runs or you have offices in multiple locations, you might have a region that's close to a branch office today. If it's not there today, it might be certainly in the future. And Microsoft is also additionally adding, continually adding additional capacity in these regions as well. One of the really fun things that I've seen news on Microsoft doing is even testing data centers running in a container underwater. So looking at interesting ways to run Azure or Azure data centers and interesting ways to cool those data centers. So what are the reasons why you would want to choose Azure, Microsoft Azure, or particularly I think Windows workloads on Azure? And I've picked a few. There's probably quite a number of additional reasons that you might find as well, but I've picked a few that I thought were interesting and typically the types of conversations that we've had with customers over the past few years as well. So the first one might be remote regions. I touched on the different regions that Microsoft has Azure presence in. So for a business who perhaps has an on-premises data center today, one of the things that they may look at is providing or expanding into additional regions, and they may need to run infrastructure workloads next to users. We need typically what we need to do for business from an IT perspective is we have users in remote regions. We may need to run workloads, get those applications close to those users for the best user experience. So instead of going out and purchasing a data center or a co-locating additional data center, doing those types of things, I can leverage Azure to essentially run those workloads in those remote regions as I expand out or as business needs change. The other one, and I find this one particularly interesting, is business continuity. So some organizations, I think, are looking at a cloud-first strategy. So they're looking at workloads that they can move to Microsoft Azure and potentially maybe do away with their on-prem data centers that they have today. And that may be a longer-term strategy that they would have in mind. But for a lot of organizations who have an on-prem data center, there might be a lot of money invested in that data center. There might be still life left in the kit that's in those data centers as well. One of the really interesting reasons for leveraging Microsoft Azure is for business continuity. So I can use Microsoft tools to replicate my on-premises workloads. They may be on Hyper-V or vSphere. I can replicate and back those up into Azure, and then in a business continuity or a BCP scenario, I can then bring those workloads up in that Azure region. And additionally, I can fail back. So I can replicate or back up into Azure from an on-prem data center today. I have a DR scenario. That DR scenario finishes or I get my on-prem data center back up and running. I can replicate those workloads back to my on-premises data center and then continue what I was doing previously. I might use that type of capacity inside Azure just for capacity bursting. So I may have specific scenarios, maybe if it's a time of the month, a financial time of the month, or the end of month, I should say, where I need to run additional capacity for financial modeling or whatever the reason may be. I can use Azure as a method to do capacity bursting. So I may have network connections into Azure, and I can treat Azure or workloads in Azure as just another data center. I can bring those workloads up for as long as I need them, and I only need to pay for those workloads while they're actually running. So when they're shut down, same as the business continuity scenario too, when I'm replicating those workloads, or if I have workloads sitting in Azure but they're actually shut down, I'm not necessarily paying for those. So in a capacity bursting scenario, I can bring those up, say, and bring them up for 8 hours, only pay for 8 hours worth of consumption while I'm actually using those workloads. So capacity bursting, whether it's say for infrastructure workloads or for its end user compute type workloads, is certainly an interesting scenario. And then finally, just treating Azure as a virtual data center. So I have worked in the past with some existing organizations that two of them I can think of in particular that have been spun out of other organizations. So they're brand new organizations in themselves, but they potentially bring with them a set of legacy applications that need to run on top of Windows. So if I'm a new business brand new business in 2019, maybe I can look at services such as Office 365 and not need any traditional or legacy infrastructure applications. But for these particular customers that we've worked with in the past, they did bring those legacy applications with them, and they needed to run them somewhere. Being a new business, it didn't make sense for them to go out and buy kit. It didn't make sense for them to necessarily co-locate kit or purchase kit and put that into their own data center. So we built essentially virtual data centers inside Azure for them. And the great thing about doing this is Azure is all built on automation. So from our perspective, that we can go and build a blueprint for a customer that would deliver a virtual data center for them, and we can build that in a pretty short amount of time and get that to sort of a pilot stage quite quickly and react quite quickly to business needs. So there's kind of 4 key reasons. As I say, that there might be a number of more. These are all infrastructure focused. There might be some additional reasons, perhaps end user compute type reasons to run on Windows workloads on top of Azure. I think these 4 are sort of the key ones that I have certainly been having conversations with customers about over the past 2 to 3 years. The other key one then is this date that's fast coming up. What are we, September? We have only a few months now, January 14th, 2020 for the end of life for Windows Server 2008 R2 and Windows 7 end of support. So these operating systems are certainly not going to stop working on these dates, but Microsoft will not be delivering any additional security updates or fixes to these operating systems. And it's not unusual for quite a number of businesses that certainly I've encountered over the past few years who still have applications running on these older operating systems. Potentially these applications are their legacy applications, or they need to continue to run these applications for historical reasons. They need to continue to get to the data that's in these applications while they continue to migrate to newer applications. But it's quite difficult for them to pick those applications up and move them to newer operating systems. So Microsoft has come out with a support statement essentially to say that if you move those workloads that are running on Windows Server 2008 R2 and Windows 7 to Microsoft Azure, you will get 3 years of additional security updates on those operating systems as they run on top of Azure. Now, to do that doesn't mean that we have to reinvent the wheel either. If we're going to take those existing on-premises virtual machines or even physical machines, they don't have to be virtualized, we can utilize or leverage Azure Migrate to replicate those machines, physical or virtual, into Azure, and then test that replication. Before we actually cut over, we can test that this application now works on top of Azure. And then when we're ready to go, we can press the switch and we can swing all those applications on a copy of the same machine that you've got on-prem and all the infrastructure that goes along with it into virtual machines that run on top of Azure. So pretty compelling reason, or I guess a pretty compelling reason to use Azure, and a good way to extend the life of those older operating systems. So as you migrate those operating systems to Azure, you can continue to get 3 years of additional security updates, which I think is probably a pretty ideal reason to then consider running those types of workloads on top of Azure. So how to do this? So I could potentially talk about how, this could be a whole webinar in itself. We could do a deep dive, but I just wanted to provide a high level picture of what this would look like. And of course, this means developing some type of plan. So what is the business justification for moving workloads to Azure, or deploying new workloads in Azure, whatever that is going to look like. What is business justification for doing so? What are the business and technical drivers? And in particular, what would be the success criteria once we've actually done that? So we work with a number of customers to help them build a roadmap and then develop perhaps a more detailed plan and design on how to actually go ahead and move those workloads, or even adopt new workloads on top of Azure. Then once we've put that plan together, next is to adopt a framework. So Microsoft provides a lot of material around a cloud adoption framework. And this applies not only to Azure, but I think any public cloud platform. Is key to a successful adoption of Microsoft Azure is a framework. So when you move workloads to Azure, we need to consider licensing, which we're going to talk about in a second. But we need to consider costs. We need to consider the types of workloads, who's going to manage those workloads. Do we need to change any of the processes that we use to manage on-premises workloads? Once we move into Azure, what types of changes to our processes do we need to consider? So in a cloud adoption framework, we can put together a governance policies around what can be deployed, where it can be deployed to, even the size of machines that could be run in Azure. So I just saw an announcement today that I can't remember the exact numbers can't remember the exact numbers, but it was crazy amount of like 1 terabyte of RAM and 400 cores of CPU in a single virtual machine on top of Azure, which for most organizations is probably not the type of VM that you want to be running. So governance and policies can be put around those types of things to say, okay, we only need VMs of this type and of this cost and of this size and so on. So therefore, they're the only types of VMs that we can deploy. We only need to run workloads in these particular regions. So therefore, these are the only places that you can deploy workloads, or the only regions that you can deploy workloads. And then we can build blueprints. So a blueprint would define what makes up those workloads. When we build, certainly when we build a virtual data inside Azure, there are a number of building blocks that are common to all of those. And a blueprint would essentially say, we are going to build a workload that's going to run Windows virtual machines of 2008 R2 or 2012 R2 or Windows Server 2016, 2019 with virtual machines on a specific size. They're going to be connected to a network inside Azure. We're going to protect that network with firewalls. We're going to be able to manage that network or the infrastructure inside that network with a certain set of policies. We have to have some considerations to operational teams who need to manage those networks and workloads as well. And we need to connect, once we've built all that inside Azure, we also need to connect that to our on-premises data center or branch offices or whatever that looks like. And certainly a blueprint is what would assist in building and enforcing what that looks like. So a typical engagement that we would have with a customer is to workshop what those business and technical drivers are, what the success criteria is, and build that roadmap. And then when we go through the design phase is to build that cloud adoption framework. What is the governance? What are the policies we need to build around what we're actually deploying? And then go ahead and build a blueprint so that we can create something that is either is going to go and build something for us in our region that we've picked, and then perhaps that is even repeatable in additional regions as well. And the final piece too is so we're talking about running Windows workloads on Azure, and as I touched on before, with the Windows Server 2008 and Windows 7 end of life, we can pick up existing workloads from on-premises and move them into Azure. We have a number of organizations. One I worked with recently wasn't older operating systems they were moving, it was new operating systems. They needed to pick them up. They didn't want to do anything with these applications because they were starting on their journey into Azure. So the idea was, let's pick up the existing workloads and just migrate them. We can replicate them, migrate them. Once we're ready to go, we can flick a switch, and now we're running our data center or our virtual data center on top of Azure. But once you've done that, there are potentially then components that you can leverage native services. So that could be completely refactoring applications. SQL Server, I think, is an interesting one. As in, I can run Microsoft SQL Server on top of an Azure VM a Windows VM in Azure, but Azure also provides native SQL services. So if the application that is used by or leveraged by that SQL database can be used as a native service, then we can consider moving away from SQL Server on Windows to a native Azure SQL database. Another good example, I guess, is a Citrix workload. So I can do Citrix XenApp on premises today, and I can build pretty much the same infrastructure that I use to service something like Citrix XenApp on top of Azure. But if I talk to Citrix Cloud, it provides native services. So I can continue to run my Windows workloads where my user sessions run and where it makes sense to keep those applications running in virtual machines. But I can leverage cloud native services to help me manage cost and potentially simplify my deployment and operation of those workloads on top of Azure as well. So once we've moved those workloads, there's 2 points here I just wanted to touch on too, is that Microsoft provides some key services once I'm running Windows workloads on top of Azure. And that is, the first one there is actually in update management. So I don't have to deploy expensive, something like Configuration Manager, for example. I shouldn't say expensive, but expensive in terms of potentially of operation. I can use cloud native services to run update management for my virtual machines on top of Azure. This can all be built into the actual provisioning process as well. So I can provision a machine, I can roll it into the Azure Update Management Service, and then Azure can go ahead and manage updates to that virtual machine. I can also manage change tracking. So this is great for operations. I can manage, or I can report on changes inside that VM. So I've deployed a virtual machine. I have my application running on top of that virtual machine. And now from an operational point of view, I can look at changes inside that VM. So from an administrative perspective, who's logged onto that VM and what changes have they made to that over the past month or so? This is all built in natively into Azure, so it's a very compelling reason, I think, for leveraging Windows workloads in this manner. And then finally, inventory tools. So I've deployed my VMs. Azure is managing updates. I'm managing and reporting on change tracking, but I can also inventory services. Or inventory applications that are installed on those VMs as well. So as I'm managing my initial set of VMs, maybe it's a small set, but I'm going to, as my business grows or I continue to adopt more and more of VMs or other services on top of Azure, then I can use the built-in inventory tools to understand one, what are the actual applications installed on those VMs? But then two, I can even take that a step further and look at the relationship between those VMs as well. So I can understand, or I can build a picture of front-end applications that talk to back-end applications and the relationship between those services. And then finally, the last piece then is probably just to touch on Windows Admin Center. So this is a new way of managing Windows that Microsoft has released. Now, it's not necessarily Azure specific. If you haven't adopted any services or virtual machines on top of Azure, you can go and deploy Windows Admin Center in your on-premises data centers today and manage your Windows VMs through a web interface. So it has a lot of tools built into it for things like Windows Defender in there. I can do disk management, I can do services, I can do Hyper-V management even through Windows Admin Center. But the really cool thing about this is now I can, once I deploy Windows Admin Center in my data center, I can use Windows Admin Center to connect my on-premises data center into Azure. So I can manage on-premises Windows servers and Windows services running in Azure through the same interface. And then as I use tools such as Azure Migrate to migrate my on-premises VMs or even deploy additional virtual machines on top of Azure, I can continue to use the same administration tool to manage those VMs regardless of where they're actually sitting. if you're familiar with the Microsoft Management Console, essentially what Windows Admin Center is doing is replacing all these earlier versions of Windows admin tools, building them into sort of an extensible web interface so that I don't have to have all these tools installed on my administration machine. I can just go to a web interface. I can manage my machine, whether it's on-prem or whether it's in Azure, from a single interface. And very, very cool stuff. So very high level touch on running Windows workloads in Azure, why you should do it, touching on how, so developing a plan, adopting a cloud adoption framework, and then potentially as you start on that journey, looking at mixing cloud native workloads where that's appropriate. And then updating or managing those, so managing updates through update management, change tracking, inventory tools that are built directly into Azure, so I can deploy a VM and I can manage those VMs with native tools, and then looking at how I can integrate on-premises and Azure workloads with Windows Admin Center. So just to sum up there, sorry, then is the call to action. So if we want to delve into some more details, because I could certainly talk about some of these things at a much deeper level in a workshop for hours on end, would be to arrange a one-on-one session with Bytes. And furthermore, then I think is attending Bytes Cloud Fundamentals workshop. I think the Bytes team can talk to these in a little bit more detail. But then 3, tune in for some future webinars where we can delve into each of these topics in more detail. So with that, I'll hand back over to the Bytes team.
Thanks very much, Aaron. I'm just going to run through some of the licensing options for Azure, primarily obviously the Windows element, but I will touch upon some other options as well. What we have is what we see typically from our customers is 2 different types of workloads. So they might have variable workloads, so where they're in dev and test, analytics, reporting, and they just want scalability and efficiency from the workloads that they have. In that case, you would look at typically your Azure pay-as-you-go option for your software licensing, but then a lot of our customers are also moving to predictable workloads. So this might be line of business applications, CRM, content management, etc. And they're looking for cost savings, flexibility in regards to that. And that's when we would look at bringing your own licenses. So you can purchase your licenses with the instances within Azure. It provides a pay-as-you-go option. There's no upfront cost or commitment. You can manage your license compliance through that. It eliminates the requirement for any Windows Server client access licenses or CALs for your users or devices. You can allocate a compute instance of the right size as per the application's requirements. Virtual machines and included software are billed on a per minute or second basis, and it's easy to calculate costs for internal cross-charging. So the licenses that are available within Azure pay-as-you-go are the Windows Server options. It also includes 2 remote desktop service connections for administration. You can also purchase SQL Server. It's licensed on a per core basis. You do, however, not get any failover rights with that. And you are also able to purchase BizTalk Server Standard and Enterprise as pay-as-you-go. I'm going to touch upon license mobility through software assurance. It is a software assurance benefit that gives customers the flexibility to deploy certain server applications on third-party shared servers. As I mentioned, it's a software assurance benefit, so you must have software assurance on those licenses. It offers a fixed price, which is tied to a volume license agreement that you may have. There is more complex license management with it, and software assurance is required on the server license and any associated CALs that come with it. There is also a license verification form that must be submitted within 10 days of deployment. Most server products are eligible for license mobility under the server and CAL model. They must have active software assurance on the server license and the client access license, and there is no need in that instance to count the core or number of processors. If you are then looking to the core model, SQL Server and BizTalk Server can be licensed per core. The metric in public cloud is vCPU or hyperthreads, not physical cores, and there is a minimum requirement of 4 cores per virtual machine that would have to be licensed. Note at the bottom, as primarily we are looking at Windows Server in this session, Windows Server and the Windows client are not eligible for license mobility, and desktop applications cannot be used on shared servers. So when looking at the Azure hybrid benefit, you can use your Windows Server licenses in Azure for less. So without the Azure hybrid benefit, you're looking at a higher cost. If you have current investments in Windows Server Standard and Data Center with software assurance, you can move these into Azure. And there are up to 40% savings to be had when using this method. So let's look at how it works. With both Standard and Data Center editions, you receive up to 2 VMs per license. You get up to 2 VMs and up to 16 cores. With Windows Server Data Center, you can run virtual machines both on premises and in Azure. With Windows Server Standard, you can run virtual machines either on premises or in Azure. And we've provided some sample configurations on the right-hand side of your screen there. So you could either have 1 VM with 16 cores, or you could have 2 VMs with 8 vCores each with a maximum of 16 cores, etc. There is also the option to stack licenses if your VM does have more than the 16 core license as shown on the right-hand side. Azure reserved virtual machine instances. They are a way of purchasing base compute in return for an upfront payment and making some choices at the time of purchase. So there is a commitment of 1 or 3 years. You can choose a type of virtual machine. I'd like to note now that not all groups of virtual machines are available under reserved instances, but obviously we can check that with you if you do require any more information. You would need to choose the region. Aaron's obviously discussed there's many regions available and data centers all around the world, so we'd need to choose that. And you can choose to deploy it at company level or department level. I'm only going to really touch upon the reservation type in the top. So infrastructure as a service. So with Windows Server, you could use the Azure hybrid benefit via software assurance or server subscriptions. So you would use a reserved virtual machine instance and then bring your Windows Server licenses via the Azure hybrid benefit. Obviously, as Aaron also mentioned, on the right-hand side, you can see platform as a service, which shows the SQL database reserved capacity, which is another option. So when looking at both the reserved virtual machine instances and the Azure hybrid benefit, there are savings of up to 82% that can be had by combining both. So pay-as-you-go, all-inclusive Windows Server virtual machine, when you add the reserved VM instance and Azure hybrid benefit, it does show those cost savings. So with reserved instance benefit, you are able to reassign licenses, reserved instances, at any time to a different department or the whole company. So if you purchase a reserved instance for your 1 or 3 year commitment option, you can reassign these at any time. So if you decided that you didn't need to use them at one stage in one department, you can move it to another department. You can also exchange reserved instances. So any time remaining will serve as a credit applied to the new reserved instance purchase. There are a couple of rules. So the new reserved instance purchase must be of equal or greater value than the prorated amount. And the new reserved instance purchase will be for the full 1 or 3 year term. Customers can also choose to cancel a reserved instance at any time during the term. Again, a prorated refund will be provided back to the original purchased method. They do, however, charge a 12% early termination fee, which will be applied to the prorated refund. And there is a cap on the amount of cancellations a customer can do per year, and currently it's around £37,000 per year. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Mel. We're just going to just check to see if we've got any questions. So again, if you do have anything you'd like to ask, you can just pop it into the questions box on the right-hand side of the screen, and we can read it out for you. So there are a couple
quick question. Can I ask one?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Can just that we can mix and match licensing with these workloads too, right? So some of those in particular might be workloads that are need to run 24/7 versus on-demand type workloads.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? Sorry.
So I can mix and match workloads, or sorry, I can mix and match licensing. So say I've got workloads that I need to run 24/7, but I've got other workloads which I need to only run during business hours. So I might have reserved instances versus pay as you go. It's the type of thing I can mix and match, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely, yes, you can.
Excellent.
Thank you. Yeah, so we do have a couple of questions. I'll just read them out. So one person, I think this might be more for you, Aaron. Someone has asked, is it possible to set up a dev test environment?
Yeah, so they're definitely key. I guess I didn't. So when I covered the sort of the planning and roadmap, I think one of the key points there that we usually cover in that is how to, certainly from an IT perspective, how to get IT teams familiar with Azure if it's not something that they've touched previously. So there are dev test licensing. Of course, I talked to the Bytes team about the dev test licensing piece, but the other one I'm aware of is Visual Studio. So Visual Studio licenses, I guess maybe they're aimed more at developers, but they also give you Azure credits, but they're a good way to sort of mix and match a number of different licensing, and it's the type of thing that that I've done personally, but either the dev test so that I can have some control around the types of workloads and I think reduce the cost on those, but also I think the Visual Studios looks like an interesting one as well.
Perfect. And the other one that we've got here is how would we go about building out a roadmap to move to Azure?
Yeah, so I kind of touched on this, and I guess it's something that we could talk about in more depth, but I think that is workshopping what this looks like. So essentially building that roadmap. So what are the drivers? What are the business requirements? What are those drivers and success criteria, I think, for moving to Azure? And I think for most organizations, that roadmap, I think, is building how do I take those initial steps and how do I move workloads into Azure? And then once I've done that, how do I adopt a continual improvement process? So that's kind of our architecture as a service process where we can come in, essentially run a one-day workshop to talk through those and then present back a workshop which would help you get started on, I guess, on that path down to moving those workloads or adopting Azure, whether it's Windows on Azure or whether it's even native workloads on top of Azure as well.
Great, perfect. So there's no more questions at this point. If anybody does want to ask anything, please, you could email tellmemore@bytes.co.uk, or of course you can reach out to your Bytes account manager. We'll be more than happy to help. There is a short feedback form at the end that will just pop up. If you could fill that in, because we really do appreciate your comments. It's just 2 or 3 questions. If you are interested in a one-to-one engagement or a one-to-many workshop if you'd like to join us. I think we've got one coming up on the 16th of October, which is sort of like a cloud fundamentals workshop on Azure. So more details about that will be sent out shortly. But if you do want more information on any of those, please speak to Bytes account manager, or again, email tellmemore@bytes.co.uk. We'll be sharing around the recording in the next sort of day or so, so keep a lookout for that. And right now I just want to say thank you to Mel and Aaron from Incentra for presenting today, and thank you for everybody who's joined us. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.